at this moment, in the year 2000, San Francisco is absolutely the belly of the beast. I mean, this is as good as capitalism gets. We have more money than almost anywhere else I've been. We should be seeing what a center of power can build and can do right now. It should be apparent. It isn't.
A basic reality in San Francisco, 49 square miles, physically mature city. New economic uses that require physical plant displaces old ones. No spare land. Land use is at the heart of San Francisco politics. Has been for as long as I've been here, and in my researches indicates to me has been since San Francisco was an Anglo city.
Let's go in here and take those voters, and I think that's extremely helpful for the electoral process in San Francisco. Again, no matter I think the heart of my philosophy about city government is one of openness, one of honesty, and one of a responsive government, which is why
I represent the choice for the West, for the North, for the East, and for the South of San Francisco. I represent the best choice for all ages, all colors, and all orientations for San Francisco. I speak with a voice of experience, with a voice of an ability to work with people and provide leadership. I speak, but only after having given each one of you a full opportunity to speak, and so I listen. And then I help you and me frame a solution and implement that solution. And that's why I think you will choose me on December 14th.
what I need to say to you now is out there, and and I mean out there. I don't mean in the halls of City Hall. I don't mean in the Democratic Club meetings. I don't mean in lunches that are hosted by political insiders. I mean out there. I mean on the Muni. I mean on the street corners. I mean in the neighborhoods. I mean in the schools. I mean in the nursing homes. I mean there is a need and feeling for change, and I think that my campaign has galvanized that change. It's not reflected in editorials. It's not reflected in polls. We have captured a base of voters who were disenfranchised, and we have lit them on fire. And I look forward to taking that torch and carrying it into the mayor's office on January 8th and give San Francisco the kind of open, honest leadership it has demanded and wants and needs to be renewed and rejuvenated by. Thank you.
But the other 8 members of that board will not follow his leadership. Unlike when I served in the legislature, everybody followed my leadership.
Time, please. Mayor Brown, the next question.
We have a candidate in Tom Ammiano who understands that this is about more than just him. This is about more than just his candidacy. This is a candidate who didn't even want to run. He was convinced to run when he understood that there is one chance left to save this city from the developers, from the corrupt, greedy lobbyists, from the people who would like to turn this whole city into a white yuppie mall, right? There's one chance. There's one chance. And that chance is Tuesday, December the 14th, when the biggest, broadest, most diverse, most militant, most hopeful, most principled coalition that this city has ever seen, that this country has ever seen, is going to stand together and shock the world. Going to shock the world.
He's not actually a radical politician. I mean, the potential was certainly there to do that. But he was riding the energy of a social movement. You know, he found it intoxicating and a little frightening what it did, and being the symbol of a social movement doesn't have anything to do with being a person. It's a horrible thing that happens to people sometimes, and it happened to him.
He has pulled off this coup, and there is this groundswell. I can't think of anything else that really compares with it. And even if he loses, I think it's going to be close, and I think that's going to enormously empower people to feel that maybe the next time they can do it. This is why this election is so fascinating and maybe a very important one. I think that people are genuinely disgusted at the blatancy of the corruption, not only here but around the country at this time, that bribery has gone so much into the open. We've simply given it another name, political contributions, but it's so blatant at this point that it sort of at times looks like I Claudius, the Rome of I Claudius, and that Tom represents the kind of indignation that is, I think, beginning to manifest itself against that there's something wrong with this. And even if he doesn't win this time, I think that this is maybe the beginning of something else.
I don't think the world is dissolved. I don't think that social meaning is impossible. That's kind of on the lunatic fringe if you're a postmodernist, where everything is dissolved and where there's only contingent meaning. 100 people walking across a bridge is 100 bridges kind of thinking. I think that's balderdash. I think there are 100 variations of a bridge, but there's common shared meaning. And if you don't have a way to think about that, we're in real trouble. And that just gives people permission to let the modern corporation have its way. I think it's a pernicious economic idea to say that there is no shared meaning.
I think geography has a big impact on cities, which profoundly influences them. And I'm thinking about Venice, a city built on an improbable location on a series of islands in the middle of a lagoon. Its walls are a moat. That not only was defensive, but it also helped Venetians to think of their city as a city-state, almost a nation to itself, very, very dense, but isolated from the rest of the world. Manhattan is the same way. Manhattan thinks of itself as an island, as a kind of an imperial island. San Francisco is very much the same. It's always been tightly constricted, which is why the land values there have always been high, and that's why you have in San Francisco, unique to all West Coast cities, a tradition of row houses. There's this tight urban quality to it. Also this sense of being a bit apart from the rest of the continent. Although it's on a peninsula, it feels like you're on an island, because it's still hard to get to, even today. I think that the feeling is increased by the fact that the buildings are so insubstantial, being made out of wood, and the knowledge or the memory of the Great Fire of 1906, that it could all vanish at any time.
The setting of San Francisco with the water and the mountains and the ocean, the bay and the ocean and the mountains, and the hills in the middle of it, make it a really spectacularly beautiful place. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people here, is just its stunning beauty. But the power isn't here. I don't see San Francisco alone as an important city. It's the Bay Area city that's important. The whole 680 corridor has to be considered part of the city. And that certainly is urban, and it doesn't look like Paris, it doesn't look like London, but I think it actually functions amazingly well as a city.
San Francisco has a very unusual position in the nation's history for 60 years. It was the unchallenged city on the West Coast. There's nothing on the East Coast that's analogous to it, not even Manhattan, because Manhattan had a number of other rivals. Throughout the West, there was only one city, that was San Francisco. And it's really not until about 1910 that it begins to be challenged by Los Angeles, Portland, and Seattle. When its leaders speak of it as the mistress of the Pacific, the Rome of the Pacific, the Paris of the Pacific, they know what they're speaking about, because even though it was very tight in its surface area, the wealth was concentrated there, the communications, the transportation, all headed for San Francisco. It was the core, it was the center. And it had a sporting chance for a while to become what it pretended to be, which was the mistress of the Pacific, to dominate the Pacific.
Some of us were not born in San Francisco. Some of us immigrated to San Francisco, and we bring with us our culture, we bring with us our heritage. What makes this city so magnificent is our shared diversity, and our input is just as important as people who have already been here.
5 years ago, San Francisco was probably one of the most economically depressed areas of the Bay Area. There was a massive withdrawal of private investment in San Francisco for a variety of reasons, not the least of which was, I believe, the '89 Loma Prieta earthquake. San Francisco being isolated as it was, physically isolated. I mean, they did close both the bridges. A number of, especially corporate folks, decided that this was not a good place to have all of their computers. The historic post-war role of San Francisco as the corporate headquarters of the Pacific Rim had by the late 80s, early 90s, totally and completely shifted. San Francisco was trying to figure out what the hell it was supposed to be.
There were two chances. At the turn of the century, it missed the opportunity to annex the East Bay and to begin creating what it called Greater San Francisco, which was modeled on New York City, adopting the borough system. If that had happened, the Bay Area would have had an integrated and efficient system of rapid mass transit, and it might have actually had a chance at that point to become the New York of the West Coast. And the other chance was right after the Second World War, when the Charter of the United Nations was signed in San Francisco, and for a brief time the UN was thinking about having its headquarters either in San Francisco or in Marin on Richardson Bay. Rockefeller became alarmed at that the center of gravity was going to move from the East Coast to the West Coast, and he made sure that the UN had free land on the East River, and that's why the UN is there rather than here.
I am a Muni rider, and I'm very concerned about Muni safety. Here's my ticket to the mayor's office, ladies and gentlemen. And you know, when I was inaugurated as board president, I took the Muni, and when I'm inaugurated as mayor, I will take the Muni to the inauguration.
We must improve Muni. I ran for mayor and made the announcement that it's going to be fixed in 100 days. A real dumb statement on reflection. Well, all of that is by the board now. The grand jury said this mayor's office is the first mayor's office in the last 2 decades that's really done anything significant about improving Muni. Public resources are public resources. They are not, and they do not lend themselves to profiteering, and I oppose privatization, period. Muni will never be sold.
There's another issue that affects all neighborhoods, housing. And then there's a second issue, housing. And then there's a third issue, housing.
I mean, it's an encouraging thing that people think that housing is the top three concerns. It's really about homeownership, rental housing, and homelessness, and you could have the three top housing issues right there. I guess I'm not all that convinced that there's any particular way to solve the housing issue by looking at housing itself.
Along with this great wealth, great poverty is being created, and that's largely because the value of land is being driven through the ceiling with all this speculation. And if you don't own a piece of land, then you're not in such a great shape. For people who aren't landlords, who aren't invested in the land, their standard of living is actually going down. And there's a great deal of poverty being created that's not being reported on.
But those of us who are tenants, who are making under $30,000 a year, what's in it for us? Except that we have to live in fear every day that we're going to get evicted. Finally, there's an election where there's class consciousness, because I have heard class talked about more in this election than I've ever heard it talked about ever before in my life. I mean, how many times do you hear a politician talking about class? It's virtually unknown in this country because we don't think we're a society that has class structure, but we do.
People of varying income levels are what makes San Francisco interesting. A lot of folks who don't earn a lot of money in San Francisco don't earn a lot of money because they're doing things that don't garner six-figure salaries. It's sort of about the commercialization of everything on some level or another, which is to say, is a person's ultimate value to society or their neighborhood or everything around them based on how much income they can produce, or is it that we see something larger than that? I guess I think most San Franciscans think that they want a city that's larger than just sort of whoever can pay the most to be here.
So I know what it means to be gentrified. I know what it means to be, what do they call it, remodeled and replaced and all those wonderful things that redevelopment put in their books. The most fantastic thing that they put in their book is that we re-people. That means that we're taking the old people and getting rid of them and we're putting new people in. Well, isn't that virtually what's happening in San Francisco right now? Willie Brown's campaign is based on re-peopling. We don't count anymore. Remember, he's the one who said if we didn't make $60,000 to $100,000 a year, we shouldn't be here. Well, we weren't making that when he was making those promises that we would not have to surrender our one-for-one replacement of public housing. We've always had poor folks, okay? He wasn't making that promise when folks were lining up in the food lines and he needed their vote. Well, that means it's time for me to plant my feet solidly on this ground, and I ain't going nowhere.
The struggle over the outcome of who will work here and therefore live here, and that's a part of the equation that the Amianoites and the Guardianites don't get. It's about who works here. It's about employment as well as housing, and it's about the relationship between employment and housing.
On a fundamental level, I mean, I guess it just sort of comes down to whether or not you think people have a right to a decent place to live. I mean, right is maybe a term that some people would have a problem with, but do you think that a society as wealthy as ours ought to make sure that everyone has a decent home over there, or a roof over their head? I sort of think on a basic level, it's about that. What I always try and convince friends of mine who are sort of more free market pricing system ought to take care of this kind of thing, poor people ought to move to other locations, is that ultimately that doesn't work in a place like San Francisco very well. We have to recognize the fact that housing is different. It's like healthcare or food or something. You just can't live without it, and so we need to treat it in the same way that we treat other basic human necessities. It can't just sort of be allowed to do whatever it wants.
We have lost the political will to take care of the people who need to be taken care of. That's a political decision. If capitalism is obviously not going to do it alone, it's got to be political will. And if San Francisco, it being at the very most profitable, the wealthiest part of America right now, we don't have the will to tax ourselves to take care of society, then I think we deserve whatever we get. We were doing better in the 70s.
I mean, I say it all the time to folks at meetings because I'm an asshole about it. But people will say, well, I can't find a place to park, or this homeless guy, so move to Danville. I mean, if you really don't like what's here, get the fuck out of the city. There's lots of other boring ass places to live in the world. We happen to live in an interesting one, and if you need a parking space, move. It's just that simple. I mean, I actually think that'd be a great fucking slogan. I'm really most scared about a situation in which we attempt to create an environment in San Francisco physically that matches a suburban desire for parking and driving and all this other stuff, and lose what makes this place interesting. That's where San Francisco can go down the shitter.
Why is it in San Francisco, why are you Marxist if you want to feed the hungry? Why are you revolutionary if you want to house the homeless? Why are you a radical if you want to prevent people from being evicted? What has happened to San Francisco?
It's like anything else. There's 785,000 of us, most of us pretty decent people, just trying to get through it all and not fuck over people or get fucked over too much ourselves, And then you get these clowns come along and it's all about the money and the power and the prestige, and that is so not what it's about anymore. This is San Francisco. We live here every day. We don't need that. We really need something better than that.
To me, what's the most upsetting thing about this whole thing is a real abdication of responsibility by the Planning Commission. If you walk around off the clock with members of the planning department, they will tell you that those live-work buildings are built for shit. They're going to fall apart in 25 years. That any architect who could walk through that building will tell you that it is the least desirable residential construction type that you could ever imagine. And I just feel like the Department of Building Inspection and the city have done all those buyers a total disservice. They got a 25-year lifespan on a $400,000 condominium. And in 25 years, they're going to come around and say, why the hell didn't somebody tell me that I was buying a piece of shit? And the folks who were responsible for it are going to be long gone.
What Tom offers is a chance to take the best of what our lives have been in this century and kind of translate that into our city for the youth of tomorrow. And I think that we have something to give them. And it ain't about live-work developments.
Well, San Francisco has this strange role in American society of being a place that people want to visit because it's so beautiful, but also because of this feeling of liberation that they have when they come here. And people both love that and they feel really uncomfortable with it, too, because it means that their moorings are cut. The routes aren't important anymore. So there's a kind of dreamlike quality which is also increased by the fog flowing across the city, which gives it a kind of dreamlike insubstantial quality.
And I think the Bay Area weather is one of the great dramas that we have here. The way the fog comes in, especially the summer fog, and sits over different parts. Going up to Mount Tam and watching being above the fog as it comes into the city is one of the great urban events. Nature in the city is as much the weather and the grass and the weeds that come out of the sidewalk as redwood parks or planned gardens. Light and weather and temperature, they're always acting on. It's just like the other parts of the built environment. And part of us is very still an animal responding to all of that. I think it's a very important part of the environment here.
The American technological sublime, there is a kind of sublimity of the confrontation, the clear-cut confrontation between man-made artifact and nature, which I think is very important in the American landscape.
culture is public because meaning is public. It's not individual. I think people can give meaning to things, new meaning to things, without even changing the look of the object or the space. Once a city is put in place, its meaning can be renegotiated informally. It can be steered from the top down as well, pretty effectively. Consider Paris. Its identity has changed many times over the last 12 centuries. It's in the same location. Some of the same buildings are still there, a few of them at least. So I think the same thing is true of a city like San Francisco. It can have a meaning established for it, and it can be reinterpreted in another time. That may be natural for a city. I think freezing identity would be what would be unnatural.
I think San Francisco is not the norm, and will probably continue to succeed in all the ways it wants to. There are enough people that want San Francisco for it to keep being the way it is.
This mayor's office can move us into the 21st century with the perspective of all the world that this is such a great city. The symbol of that city must in fact be the mayor's office. The symbol of that city must in fact be our city hall. The symbol of that city must be your government. I want to be the individual that continues to lead that symbol, continues to respect and reflect your needs in this city. We together produced a magnificent public structure. It has every feature that you could think of for the modern day use of the building, with all the old charm that was originally there in 1915. It occurred in partnership with the Heritage Foundation. It occurred in partnership with those from the handicapped community. It occurred from those in the world of technology, because it is also a very smart building. The standard of that building ought to be the standard for all of San Francisco.
We wouldn't have landmarks if we didn't have background. That background, the everyday fabric, is terribly important. The street grid itself, the lattice of lots, are still really important actors in the way we build in San Francisco.
We're very proud in San Francisco of our architectural heritage and what it represents culturally to us. If you look at it as a kaleidoscope, you can actually trace the involvement of San Francisco. We really have to find funding for our landmark advisory board and also work with the Heritage Society to come up with ways to survey our historical and architectural buildings, commission historic districts. I know that as a school teacher, I really want kids to know what the history of San Francisco is, not to have it obliterated by overdevelopment. I'm not saying I'm a Luddite. I think that you need to have progress, but there also has to have a balance achieved, and I think that the citizens of the different districts can speak to that best.
The first thing I ask about a monument is, where does the money come from? Not who designed it. In architecture history, what I like to find out is, who are the clients? Because it takes a very savvy client to get a great building, not just the architect.
San Franciscans want to think of themselves as being a city-state with a city hall which is in fact grander and larger than many state capitals, and is a palace. Sonny Jim Rolfe, the man who built it, who was probably the closest thing we've ever had to a real emperor of San Francisco. On the other hand, we're really uncomfortable with that. We want to believe that citizens have a say in city governance. Americans are often uncomfortable with living in a democracy because in some ways they regret that they gave up a monarchy in 1776 by having the revolution. And Willie Brown in some ways fulfills our desire to have an emperor. On the other hand, we have that feeling that we are a democracy too, and we don't really want that.
Well, it's perfectly reasonable to use the word landscape for rural scenery, an arranged, beautiful view. In English, somewhere around 1500 or 1600, that kind of painting comes to be called a landscape. And hence, landscape designers were often used to create that kind of Arcadian view. I use the term landscape as cultural landscape, as people making space, whatever people build to create a background for their day-to-day life. An office tower counts as well as a backyard. J.B. Jackson always talks about the official as the extreme, permanent, long-lasting space itself, and the vernacular at the other end, which is temporary and changing and contingent and just for now. They're always in a tension with each other. The official lots and streets last so long because they are so official and the buildings come and go on them. The sedimentation of social relations. That's what the city is. We are taking place. We have bodies. We have to take place. And there are people who take high-style places, and usually people of more power and education who are very self-conscious about making places, outdoors, indoors. And there are people who, as they build or buy a house or add onto the backyard, may not be self-conscious about it, but are certainly making places. And all of that makes up an urban landscape. It seems to me it's important to talk about both the high style and the everyday in one definition. They're basically vacant lots. In the city of 1910, they would have been called vacant lots and sand lots, just undeveloped places. And now that the public in San Francisco owns these hilltops, they're just kind of unnaturally preserved. Most of them are now buildable. There's no such thing any longer in San Francisco with housing costs in the $1 million range as an unbuildable lot. So all these empty hills we have in San Francisco could be housing. But at the moment, they're clearly vernacular parks. They usually acquire a name given by the neighborhood, and the neighborhood kind of manage them informally. And I think eventually we will make them into formal parks.
San Francisco really begins changing its politics in the late 50s and then especially in the 60s, and it changes fast. Before then it had been largely a sort of moderate Republican town. But the politics become completely different and very different from the rest of the country. It becomes what one political scientist has called left coast city. And there was a kind of a live and let live quality to it. There was this kind of sophistication in the midst of this spectacular natural setting with very cheap rent, cheap wine, easy sex. The beatniks were the ones who started it. Then gays and lesbians started moving in the 60s, and then you had the influx of the hippies. And what you had is a real demographic change in San Francisco with these sort of rootless and often young people coming in. And they began changing the whole politics, the culture of the city. Also, of course, the trauma of Vietnam and everything that went along with it, the civil rights movement, the riots that were happening at San Francisco State and at Berkeley. All of this was tremendous trauma, not only to the country, but also the Bay Area as well, too. It was an education for people in who really ran the country. People were becoming very sophisticated at analyzing power at that time and who really ran things and whose benefit it was all for. And there were other people who were neighborhood activists who were beginning to ask really important questions, such as how much can we grow without destroying everything? All of this shifted San Francisco very much to the left.
From the beginning, when Hank Wilson came and asked if they could use Josie's for a couple of hours a day if Tom decided to go for the writing campaign. And then he decided to go, and then they started using it, and the 2 hours a day quickly became all day.
It's part of urban life to find impromptu uses for spaces.
It was a natural for Ron to let us use this facility, also because he's winding down.
In fact, I thought I was closing last year. I did close. And then 2 months later, I decided to reopen. It just is a coincidence. Actually, I really think this location was very helpful in the early days of the campaign, to be honest with you. It's a warm, welcoming space in a good location, and from the first day, people started showing up here, wanting to work, wanting to give, wanting to help. I am very proud of it. I am. I talked to my grandmother. That's who Josie was my grandmother. And the last few weeks, I've kind of had some very bemused conversations with her about how this all just came out of nowhere. When my landlord, a straight Chinese American father of 4, when he talks about it would be bad for the community if Josie's had closed, this is the community he's talking about. He was talking about. Neither one of us knew it at the time. I've seen so much enthusiasm and energy come through that front door. It's really quite incredible. Win, lose, or draw, that's really a giant step forward. What I see with these kids coming in, and they're young, they're going to be here a long time after I'm gone and Willie's gone. This is a very important part of their maturing, their education, their life experience, whatever you want to call it. Just because they have seen that electricity, that, very rare.
It is our time to make it revolution. You are wrong when you said election. Election is different.
Where we sort of run out of ideas is when we start talking in arcane language that people don't relate to, so your everyday person doesn't know the planning code. But if you say to them, what kind of city do you want this to be? How do you want to make sure that it gets that way? I think we can convince folks that it's worth the types of things people are suggesting. It is a city where people are willing to spend, like I just did, 4 hours on a weekend, figuring out how a neighborhood ought to solve its problems and how to accommodate lots of different folks. I mean, when we do community meetings in the Mission District, you can have a homeless guy sitting next to a law and order type, sitting next to a business person, and they actually give a shit to come out and talk to each other and do that. That doesn't happen everywhere. A lot of other places, people just say, fuck it, I can do my thing here, and regardless of whether or not you're here or not, I'm still going to be able to do it, so I'm just going to figure out a way to get the hell rid of you. That they're willing to spend the time, paid or unpaid, to make this place, this region, the society we live in, better, and feel slighted by a city hall that just doesn't seem to give a shit about those efforts, and is willing to sort of listen more carefully to someone who's able to put up $50,000 for a Democratic fundraiser, regardless of whether or not they're actual people doing wrong in terms of taking money or something. They're not doing right. I mean, San Francisco's sort of odd. It's just really, think about it, 66% of the city voted to have more affordable housing development. They voted for a $100 million bond to do more affordable housing development. Where else in the United States do people do that? Nowhere.
Really tough capitalists are in New York or Chicago or Houston. Their children come to live and retire at age 30, and we're kind of left as a residence for sort of the children of the wealthy. That's when I sense we lost our ruling class early in San Francisco. And the real power people are actually in Los Angeles. You can feel it when you go to LA, that there's power in the air here. We have this kind of vacuum. Not that there aren't powerful people still here, but they're really only a handful. It's a lot like Boston, which loses its power in 1825 to New York, but doesn't admit it even today.
I don't have the plan all worked out, and I don't want to work the plan out, because it's got to come from the people like this came from all of us. This was not scripted, which is what's so amazing. I'm amazed that we've pulled off what we have, given that there was no script.
Downtown is seen to be conservative, more Republican, vested interests, big money, and the neighborhoods, which are more grassroots, small businesses, people trying to make a living. You could also characterize it as being renters versus landlords too. So there are all these cleavages in San Francisco which make it such an interesting place. The fact that everybody's living together in a very dense sight. People tend to get very involved in politics in the way that they don't in many other cities.
The core of the campaign were young white people whose ability to continue to live in San Francisco is threatened by the fact that we're deluged in dot-com money, who have terrific skills, and who are by and large not among the people who are profiting at the top of the boom. Many of Willie's voters were residents of color of San Francisco who are probably a little bit better off because of the boom, but are, like the young white people, have the sense of hanging on for dear life in the city. But their solution to hanging on for dear life was to go with the guy they knew, who they associated with the boom. So we were seeing the ordinary progressive coalition split by different responses to the boom.
20-something slackers in the Mission who are screaming and yelling about being gentrified are simply the first generation of gentrifiers being gentrified by a second generation. So there's a certain hollowness in that, and a certain amount of envy, and that does not bear real close analysis.
Our notion that San Francisco is already gentrified completely is not true. There's an astounding diversity of ethnicity and race, lifestyle, of sexuality. All those things are still part of the city and probably won't go in the near future. I would expect vagaries of economics to change enough that the current processes that seem so dominant probably won't last continuously for 20 years.
And all over the city, you have people wanting economic turndowns on some level or another because the housing situation is so far out of whack. And you hear folks talking all the time about things that should be negatives in a neighborhood. People are so stuck trying to figure out what the answer is to it that they find themselves wishing for things that they don't really want because no one can figure out what the magic stick is for this whole thing.